I knew the company was doomed the moment Jared walked in. He didn't stride so much as pivoted into the room, like a new headliner checking sound. Grin too wide, sleeves rolled to show off a watch that cost more than my first server rack, and a slide deck titled Cloud Native Future, Why Legacy Must Die. There was a cheap confidence about him. You know the type. Freshly minted CTO, smells faintly of over-caffeinated optimism, and a Gary Vee speech he half-listened to on the way in. He offed at the table, at me, and said very sincerely, "We are going to rip that old logic out. It's deadweight." The room did the thing rooms do when an ambitious person says something extreme. It made itself small. Eyes ducked to laptops. Somebody coughed. Brenda from HR smiled in the practiced way of someone who has learned survival is easier than truth. Richard, our CEO, lifted his hand, not to stop Jared, but to arrange how the blame would be bought later. Publicly supportive, privately hedged. I sat with a styrofoam cup of coffee sweating between my palms. I had built the thing they were calling legacy. I had written its guts in the middle of a crisis 3 years earlier, when freight contracts stopped honoring deliveries and the ops team was literally running around with clipboards and shouted statuses. They called it Quantum Ops, a brittle name, but it was the backbone of how this company could keep promises to vendors, reconcile invoices, and feed a dashboard that the CFO loved. It had saved the company through the winter of 2020. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. People like me don't build prettiness. We build the scaffolding that stops trains from leaving the station early. I'd done it as a contractor. I'd incorporated ironclad logic because I like getting paid and because I hate being at the mercy of people who think ownership means slapping a logo on a product. The company licensed Quantum Ops from Ironclad Logic. They paid a periodic fee, and in return, they got the right to run the software, but not the right to claim it as theirs. I owned the plumbing. They paid to turn on the taps. I didn't sell the house. I was renting an apartment with a lock on the front door. That arrangement had saved my sanity, and would, as it turned out, save my neck. But at the time, it was just a pragmatic choice. I had a mortgage, a cat that thought she was a tiger, and a distaste for corporate equity promises that read like bedtime stories. I wrote the licensing agreement with a lawyer named Heavy Metal Dave, who wore biker boots and smoked cigars in the courtroom. He loved clauses the way some people love obscure vinyl. Clause 3.1, Clause 6, Paragraph 4. These were not poetry, but they were precise enough to make grown executives sweat. So when Jared announced his plan, delete the central logic gate, rebuild in microservices, call it liberation, I felt a small, ancient part of me that had built things flare up. Not because I was averse to improvement. I love a good refactor.
But because delete is a word people use when they want to erase the work of other people and call it innovation. He finished his slide and landed his hand on the laptop like a seal. "We're doing this Friday," he said. "We cut the old stuff, we move fast, and we show the board audacity." Friday, I learned that week, is a sacred day for ruthless decisions. There's something about the weekday that feels like a cloak for letting people go when they won't be there to respond. Friday afternoon dismissals are efficient. They carry a specific grief rhythm. HR can shepherd the person out, the Slack channels will flare and die over the weekend, and come Monday the company will be one step closer to the brave new thing. It's a theatrical device dressed up as operational efficiency. Brenda called me into a small glass fishbowl of an office. The air smelled faintly of Nag Champa someone had brought into the lobby in the mornings to keep vibes centered. She had the severance packet open like a catechism. "We're grateful," she said. "This is standard. Please return your badge, your laptop." She said it with that soft tenderness reserved for fragile egos and expensive furniture. I handed the badge across the table and set the company laptop down. I imagined them expecting a stunned silence, maybe an apology. What they got was a hand over the folder on my lap. The folder creaked like it remembered being weathered. "You're making a mistake," I said. It was the wrong tone. I'd done the wrong thing to say that, and they all looked slightly offended, as if a minor domestic appliance had spoken during a dinner party. I slid the manila folder toward Richard. He opened it because the one thing executives like is to see pages that might be expensive to litigate. It was the licensing agreement. It wasn't dramatic, just pages bound with corporate care. Clause 3.1, grant of license. Clause 6, payment terms. Paragraph 4, revocation rights. The language was plain. Use of the licensed modules required timely payment, and the licensor retained the right to revoke access upon material breach. There were stipulations about unauthorized modification and a requirement that the company notify Ironclad Logic of any plans to alter the software architecture. There were plain English interpretations written in the margins by a lawyer's hand. Protects licensor from unlicensed derivative works. Wait, Jared said. He sounded less like a person in control and more like a man looking at a math problem he didn't want to do. You're saying you own this? That you've been here 3 years. You built this for us. I built it under Ironcloud logic, I said. I licensed you the runtime. We negotiated support, patches, and enhancements. That's been the relationship. I could see the legitimacy of the statement land on them like a brick. That's absurd, Jared said. We're a company. We bought the work. You bought a license to run the work for the term specified, I said.
You didn't buy the code. He frowned, and the room did that other tech room thing where people looked at their shoes while pretending to look at their phones. Mike, who sat in the back and had the startled eyes of someone who just got invited to a secret, raised his hand like a school kid. Jared, we've been maintaining it. We've been patching around the edges. We can spin up microservices. That's fine, Jared said, but you can't stop progress. You can't hold our infrastructure hostage. He said hostage like it was a clever roast. You're doing a solid job reducing the English language to snackable Twitter takes, I said. But this isn't hostage. This is contract. He blinked. I think he expected a different kind of scene. Someone on their knees, begging to stay, name-dropping product roadmaps like holy relics. This wasn't that. I had an odd satisfaction at the mismatch between his expectation and reality. It was, frankly, delightful. Not the joy of triumph, more like the warm certainty that comes from remembering where you put your wallet. Brenda tried to mediate. We can negotiate, she said soothingly. Maybe a buyout, a transfer, something. A buyout, I said, is a thing you can choose to do. There's a clause for acquisitions here, but you have to offer something that reflects the revenue it protects. People had been counting on Quantum Ops to reconcile payments that poured through the platform. It wasn't sentimental value, it was cash flow. I had been conservative in my pricing in the past because I didn't want to be the villain. This time, maybe I wouldn't be so parochial. Richard leaned forward. He wasn't cruel, he was measured. He also had to keep the board on the house. Let's not escalate, he said. Tell us what you want. I told him the obvious, a valuation based on the fraction of revenue the system safeguarded. The room, previously tuned to Jared's Tesla smartphone kinetic energy, went quiet as if someone had turned down the bass. The dismissal ritual still happened because performance is theater in the corporate world. I resigned from my day-to-day on paper because there was no point to pretending. They wanted my badge and the optics of the exit. I gave them the badge with a small, quiet flourish. Then I went home. That's when the real thinking started. Most people in tech who reach a certain point in their careers know, in the same way you know the coffee in the break room is burnt, that contracts are not simply legal documents, they are arsenals. They are boring and procedural, and therefore powerful in the most demoralizing way. When you put specifics down in black and white, people forget to read them because corporate life is scheduled in meetings and memes. Heavy Metal Dave had made sure the contract had teeth. I had been diligent in paying myself, in keeping records, in invoicing like a small, steady machine. You don't get to be called sweetheart in a meeting room and have it be the only thing that defines you. There was a choice in front of me, and the choice wasn't obvious. I could have taken the heartbeat of the company and turned it into a lecture about respect. I could have binged documentaries and tried to go viral. I could have been the person who, with a traumatized dignity, posted a resignation on LinkedIn and watched it ripple into humble brags and comment likes. Or I could do something less theatrical and more transactional. The law does not reward theatricality. It rewards documentation, records, and the willingness to walk away when the math favors you. So I called Heavy Metal Dave and put a bottle of bourbon on the counter. Old Crow, because sentimentality is not part of this. He chuckled at me as he always did, the kind of laugh that knows you a little too well and is mildly invested in your tendency to be reasonable. You sure? He asked. Pretty sure, I said. And more than that, I'm tired. Tired is a small word that hides a lot of reasons. I had been in conference rooms where the language used to describe me was legacy, as if the years I had spent stopping trains were some collectible furniture. I was tired of watching people who had never had to hold a system at midnight decide how it should be lit. Tired of hearing sweetheart. Tired of being the quiet person who fixes things and does not get invited to the photograph. We talked about the clauses, routine lawyer speak rendered in a courtesy I could stomach. Breach, remedy, revocation. He reminded me gently that contract enforcement was not revenge. It was mechanism. You don't have to be the bad actor, he said. You have to be the actor with a contract. That weekend, I did something oddly domestic to keep my hands from shaking. I made a playlist. It was a stupid therapeutic list of things that made me feel like myself. Old Crow, some Danny DeVito interviews where he says things exactly as he means them, a bit of ropey metal for the part of me that used to patch kernel panics at 3 a.m. I cleaned the dust off the manila folder and reread the clauses, marking one passage with a sticky note that said simply, payable 30 days. The company had missed a payment cycle. It was technically overdue. Someone in finance had been oddly conversational about delay, as if revenue was a suggestion. Jared, bless him, had been spending money they did not yet have in the name of momentum. When you live inside systems, you learn that money speaks in slow, stubborn syllables. You also learn that the people who panic the most are those who thought they could do the math in their heads and didn't have to actually open ledger software. I spent that Saturday making sure everything on my end was tidy. I had never been sloppy about invoicing. I liked the calm logic of numbers. It is far more honest than promises. I had the invoices out, dated and precise.
I had backups, snapshots, and records of support hours. I had logged the change requests Jared's team had ignored in their rush to move fast. I took photographs of my GitHub comments like a person taking pictures of their dinner. Innocent, archival stuff that would later make a courtroom boring and decisive. Mike texted that night because Mike had become my unexpected ally. He was junior, smart in a way that made him dangerous to his own career trajectory, and he cared. Coffee tomorrow? He wrote. Need to pick your brain. Bring caffeine and a moral compass, I replied. He came in like a man bringing a flag. The kids smelled like youthful indignation and cheap deodorant. He had been here since before Jared, and he hated the idea of throwing away stability for vanity. We talked in a small, purposefully ordinary office that smelled of old pizza and printer toner. His job was twofold: keep the systems running and report the things they were being told to ignore. He had been incrementally frozen out, calendar invites reduced, access to certain dashboards limited. He showed me a message thread where Jared had referred to my work as code debt in a way that suggested debtors should be shamed publicly. You're actually going to do something? Mike asked. He was equal parts excited and quietly ashamed that the adult in the room was, in fact, someone with a folder and a plan. Something that has documentation, I said. Something that is lawful and proportional. He nodded. He wanted to help. I couldn't ask him to commit to anything illegal or sketchy. I was the adult with the folder and the mortgage and a weird taste in bourbon. I had to keep it that way. On Friday evening, they gave me the ceremonial severance email. It was a thing of corporate art. A template, a link to a form, and the obligatory best wishes. I saved it, because bureaucracy is an excellent witness. You can't have the audacity to accuse corporations of bad behavior without receipts. The email signed off with, "We appreciate your contributions," as if that made up for the remainder of the year's payroll they'd be balancing on whether they'd bought a new vendor or not. I left the office with nothing dramatic. No raised fist, no sights set on viral retribution. I left with a sense of preternatural calm. There is a kind of focus that settles in when you have read your contract more carefully than your adversary has read theirs. It isn't righteous, it's practical. The weekend before what was scheduled to be our last day of operations for the old stack had a peculiar kind of theater. I tried to sleep and found instead that my brain was a small machine running decision trees. I drank neat bourbon and tried not to think about the ways revenge stories go sideways. I watched Danny DeVito videos on YouTube. His bluntness is salve. He has the right to be blunt without being cruel. I arranged the manila folder like a talisman on my kitchen counter. You have to understand the moral arithmetic here. I had invested sweat and time into something that made the company money. The contract recognized that. The company wanted to pivot in a way that ignored the payment terms. I could have folded my hands and written pretty LinkedIn posts about growth. Instead, I chose to rely on paper, on invoices, on the small, almost sinister power of deadlines. On Sunday afternoon, I walked to a small park and fed 2 squirrels that were unusually friendly, as if they were preternaturally aware of the coming Monday. Life goes on in small loops while big things loom. There is comfort in that. It reminds you that systems are made of people who have lives outside charts and slides. I thought about the people who would be hurt if the system went down, not as objects, but as humans, who had dinner plans and mortgages and children. That moderated my feelings. This was not about joy in someone else's panic. It was about consequence. Monday morning arrived as these things do, with an indifferent regularity. The company, having promised flight and been convinced of the brilliance of prophecy over bookkeeping, had taken certain measures. Jared had gone full steam on the migration plan.
He slept precisely the way men who have never lost a pitch sleep, assured, hands folded around promise. I had not exhausted all options. I had not maliciously plotted. I simply executed in a way that was entirely within the language Heavy Metal Dave had written for me. The license terms were enforceable upon material breach, which included non-payment and unauthorized modification. Payment had been missed. Notices had been sent. There is a strange silence before things become noisy. I sat at my kitchen table with 2 phones, a legal pad marked with bullet points, and a playlist that oscillated between old country and aggressive punk. The manila folder rested beside my elbow. My hands were steady. I was not triumphant. I was relationally tired and constitutionally precise. At the designated hour, I flipped the contractual switch. I will not tell you how, because contracts are not about theatrics, and this is not the moment for a technical blueprint. What I will tell you is that the mechanism I used was the mechanism spelled out in the agreement, a lawful revocation right, exercised by a licensor when conditions were met. It is the difference between changing the locks and burning the house down. Mine was the lock. Then I sat. You cannot overstate how dreadful waiting feels when you expect machinery to cough. The first sign was a message from Mike that came through as a stream of emoji and punctuation. Everything is weird. Dashboards red, invoices failing, payroll pings. I smiled without meaning to, not because people were suffering, but because something which had been abstracted and spoken of in boardrooms was now present and audible. It had weight and consequences, and would demand conversation. Jared called me.
He did not raise his voice. He sounded like a man who had swallowed a lemon and was politely asking where he had gone wrong. "Emily," he said, "this is what happened. Our dashboards are showing errors. Our vendors are complaining. This is not the intended behavior." "It is the intended behavior when a license is not honored," I said. "You chose to prioritize a pivot over a contractual obligation." He tried the negotiation posturing you see in 1,000 conversion narratives. Urgency, bluster, an offer to talk now. Richard appeared on the chain, if not in person, like a lever with a polite face. "Can we resolve this?" he asked. "We can make this right." Of course. The company could make things right. Companies make things right with money, with timelines, with contracts, with buyouts. The question now was whether what they offered would reflect the revenue this system protected. That was an empirical question, not an emotional one. I listened to Jared plead in the way people do when they've built castles and slides. He talked about timelines and ambition, and how technical debt was a disease we needed to excise. I let him talk. Lawyers call this letting the other party prove their need. It's more polite than it sounds. People who beseech you reveal much about how badly they need a thing. Mike texted a photo of the ops board. The red lights looked like an over-caffeinated holiday display. There was a hum of escalating messages in our Slack. Someone had dropped a line to legal. Someone else had posted a GIF of a man falling off a ladder. Crisis management, in its first hour, looks a lot like people scrambling for metaphors and not a lot of strategy. I rang Heavy Metal Dave. He drank a cigarette like it was his way of perfuming the proceedings. He said simply, "You did what the contract allows. Depending on how they respond, you have leverage." Leverage is a carnival word. It sounds like drama and it feels like math. In the context of companies, leverage is when your decision forces someone with less legal groundwork to move. They hired people who could not afford downtime. They had customers who expected deliveries. The math, in a way, was on my side. Rebuilding a system of that scale is not trivial and not cheap. Jared's reaction oscillated between righteous anger and the first cold sweat of panic. He called more, texted more. He tried to municipalize the problem. We have a town to run. People rely on us. I agreed. People did rely on us. That didn't change the terms. By late afternoon, Richard's tone had softened into a business voice that admits risk. "We can't let this drag," he said. "Put us a number. Tell us what it would cost to make this go away." There it was, the negotiation line. No threats, no heroic speeches, just the quiet commerce of problem resolution. That is the moment where the story changes from grievance to transaction. I did not set a ransom.
I set a price based on a fraction of the revenue the system was known to protect. It was a number that made the CEO pause, because it was bigger than his quarterly bonus, but smaller than the cost of a month of downtime. It was a number that reflected the reality that rebuilding takes people, time, and intangible domain knowledge, the kind of knowledge that boardrooms do not like to quantify until their numbers are read. There was an exchange of emails where we both did our best impersonation of calm. Jared included a spreadsheet marked Project Plan Migration, where the timelines looked like the prophecies of a man with optimism budgets. I replied with an invoice and the clause citations, each one clinical and unromantic. The company had options: litigate, rebuild, buy. Litigation takes time and costs money. It doesn't put servers back online overnight. Rebuilding costs money and time and maybe a different kind of humility. Buying transfers the problem to them and costs them an immediate outlay. They could also choose to double down on the pivot and accept the hit to revenue. I could have sympathy for any of those choices. I had been a pragmatic engineer once myself, but I also had a mortgage. That night I slept more than I had expected. There is no pure pleasure in watching an organization square. There is only clarity about the consequences of arrangements. I woke to a dozen new messages that had accumulated like morning traffic. Mike had been texting updates, some panicked, some oddly amused. Jared is pacing, he wrote. Brenda looks like she wants to cry. The next few hours were a slow-motion negotiation. People sent things that were both earnest and performative. There were calls where the CEO asked whether I would consider a smaller fee if they agreed to certain milestone payments in the future. There were spreadsheets with note fields that read like apologies. I watched all of it from the vantage of someone who had made the choice to be tidy and lawful and to let consequence follow. I made my position clear. I would restore access if and when the contractual obligations were met, or if the company and I reached an acceptable acquisition arrangement. I also made it clear I was not interested in returning as an employee. The last thing I wanted was to become someone's cautionary tale about being too expensive. There was a moment that felt almost biblical. Jared, who had called me sweetheart in a meeting the previous week, an epithet that sits in the same basket as misguided paternalism, sent a message that was thinly veiled apology. It's astonishing how quickly certain people find their manners when money is at stake. By mid-afternoon, there was an internal memo circulating, the kind companies write and hope nobody reads too closely. They looped legal in. They looped finance in. They looped people who did not normally get looped in and asked them to pretend they had been involved for months.
It was all theater and taxonomy, and underlying it, a genuine scramble to stabilize a failing revenue stream. I watched the red lights. I drank cheap coffee and put a slat of Old Crow balanced on the edge of the manila folder. The folder had become less of an instrument and more a symbol. Not revenge, not triumph, but the consequence of not reading their mail. For the first time in a long time, paperwork felt like a small, tidy instrument of justice. Then, in the late afternoon, Mike sent a photo of Jared sitting alone in a conference room, looking very much like a man who had been taught a lesson by invisible consequences. His watch was still expensive. His lunch was still energy bar and a smoothie someone paid to be photographed. He had learned something about hubris. This, then, is where the story rests for now. The license had been exercised. The company was in the uncomfortable moment of choosing how to buy its way back into continuity or accept the hit. There would be more phone calls, more lawyers, more spreadsheets. There would also be a decision Richard would have to make that would not only affect Jared's title and career, but also the immediate financial health of the company and the lives of the people whose paychecks flow through Quantum Ops. For me, there was an odd clarity. I had set the lock, not to gloat, but to convert the company's dependency into a conversation with economic teeth. I had not broken anything that wasn't already conceptually broken, an executive class that believed ownership was a social signal rather than a legal reality. I put the manila folder back on the counter and watched the city settle into evening. The lights in the office windows made a pattern you could read, if you were a person who liked patterns. Some towers were dim, some towers were bright. A small private victory is, in many ways, its own type of solitude. One of us, Mike texted, is sending Jared a Gary V. screed, and it's glorious. I laughed. Humor is ballast in these moments. It's how you keep your humanity when you're dealing with ledgers and leverage. I poured a small measure of Old Crow and toasted to gravelly things. Contracts, clarity, the part of me that liked to be precise. It isn't a celebration. It's a quiet acknowledgement that you can win your dignity back without making a spectacle of someone else's ruin. Later that night, the legal team at the company sent a terse email requesting an emergency meeting. They used the word escalation twice and included a list of proposed times. I set my phone on the table with the manila folder open beside it, the pages slightly fanned like the wings of something ready to fly. I didn't envy their position. I had been in it before, the emergency of a system down, the 1,000 tiny decisions you have to make when your pipelines choke. But I also knew theirs.
Decisions made under duress are rarely pretty.
At midnight, I turned off the lights and stood in the dark for a moment, thinking of the people who built the systems that keep commerce honest. Invisible architects, I thought. They make the trains run and no one applauds. There's a justice in reading your contract and, when necessary, asking for payment. There is also a humility in knowing that making people suffer in order to be paid is not a virtue. I was not a hero. I was a person asking for what was owed. I slid the folder into the manila envelope and set it by the phone. Outside, the city breathed. Taxi lights, someone laughing, a dog barking. Inside, the house was quiet. I thought about Danny DeVito and his blunt, unadorned truth-telling, and I smiled at the absurdity of finding softness in a folder of clauses. In the small hours, there was one last message from Mike. If this goes sideways, come to the bub. First round's on me. I thought about that and felt something like gratitude. It's odd how small gestures can mean so much when the machinery of commerce hums like a beast. I packed the manila folder in my bag. There are times in life when you have to be ready to defend what you built, not with violence, but with the unromantic power of paper, records, and calm persistence. At dawn, I sat at my kitchen table with coffee that tasted like overcooked bravery and watched my laptop screen. My inbox had a message marked urgent in the font used by people who need you to believe they have agency. There were spreadsheets, proposals, a prospective timeline for an acquisition, and a number that was exactly what I had expected. Not cruel, not generous. I clicked on the message from Richard. He asked for a call. Let's talk, it said. I put the phone on speaker and waited as his voice filled the kitchen, polite and thin. He sounded tired, like someone who had been playing gladiator with quarterly targets and was now regretting the armory he had supplied to inexperienced officials. Emily, he said, we want to avoid damage. Tell us what you need. I recapped the invoice, the clauses, the reasonable price. We spoke in figures and in the language of risk. I could hear Jared's voice in the background, a murmur like a storm. He was pacing a room with a view he had not learned to respect. There was shame there, yes, but also a little enlightenment, the kind you get when you realize your toys have consequences. Richard asked for time to confer. He promised to call back. He did not promise anything else. That is how companies make their decisions, in the time between promises and back channels. I sat back and let the quiet take me. The manila folder had returned to its place of honor. The city outside was waking, and the world continued its indifferent rotation. There was a clause for this, too. Time to consider, time to negotiate, the slow arithmetic of consequence. When the phone buzzed again, it was Mike. Something about payroll, he wrote. People are asking.
The hum of potential consequence vibrated in my chest like a nervous drum. I drank the last of my coffee and thought about the week ahead. There would be calls, lawyers, offers, probably an acquisition proposal, or a long, tedious argument about derivatives and rebuild costs. There would also be a board meeting where the numbers might look worse than they already did. I have never liked the word checkmate because it implies joy in someone else's defeat. What I wanted, and what the contract had allowed me to demand, was a fair reckoning. Payment for work that had protected revenue, recognition that my name was not a footnote, and the option to walk away on terms that kept my dignity intact. The first part of that reckoning had occurred. The lock had been turned, the red lights had blinked bright, and the company had found, very quickly, that infrastructure is less forgiving than rhetoric. As the sun lifted and the city unfolded into its customary chaos, I sat with the manila folder and a small pile of invoices and thought about the future. Would they buy the IP? Would they attempt to litigate? Would they rebuild and try to make me the villain in their quarterly narrative? I reached for my phone, and before I called Richard back, I texted Mike, "Bring coffee, be ready. This is going to be a long day." He replied with a thumbs up and a photo of his mug that said in all caps, "Hold the fort." I smiled. Then I clicked accept on the next meeting invitation. The clock moved forward. The chessboard was set. The emergency meeting started with slides and ended with handshakes that felt like small, private surrenders. They convened in a glass-walled room that smelled faintly of reheated quinoa and corporate panic. Legal joined from a room with a fancier view. Finance dialed in with a spreadsheet so tightly packed it looked like a ransom note. And Jared appeared on video with a face that had learned to be polite and not to sound entirely panicked. Richard led the call like a man who'd practiced being calm for board presentations and was now trying to buy himself time with measured words. "Emily," he said, "we appreciate you taking the call. We want to resolve this without more disruption. Help us understand what you need to restore service." There was something almost religious about how the question was framed. Restore service, restore order, like an exorcism for bad planning. I had been asked that question in worse-built rooms, when the rails were smoking at 3 a.m, when a vendor had failed to ship, when children were kept awake by the cry of failing systems. None of those nights felt like this one. Those nights had moral clarity. This one was a debate about who had read what page. I could have asked for a token amount and called it closure. I could have turned the whole thing into moral theater and demanded apologies from Jared in front of the board. Instead, I gave them a number tied to business, not to my feelings.
The invoices, the clauses, the ledger entries had already done most of the rhetorical heavy lifting. What remained was arithmetic coupled to practicality. "You can either purchase the intellectual property outright," I said, "or you can make the outstanding payments and enter a new maintenance agreement on terms that secure continuity for your customers." There was a beat where everyone pretended the decision didn't matter. They invited their lawyers to speak, and those lawyers said things like, "We need to review the contract language, and we should consider mitigation costs." I translated. They were buying time. I set the acquisition price in a way that was blunt but defensible, a fraction of the annual revenue Quantum Ops tangibly protected. It was not spite-priced. It was what the system saved the company every year, multiplied by a risk buffer and a premium for the domain knowledge embedded in years of asynchronous comments, runbooks, and the particular way the code tolerated vendor idiosyncrasies. The number landed in the room like a weather report. Someone, probably Jared, probably his PR-trained instincts, tried to recast the negotiation as a character flaw. "Is this about ego? Is this about payback?" he asked, as if his slide deck gave him the moral high ground. "It is about value," I said, "and about not teaching business partners they can treat licensors as invisible." They asked for time. They asked for references to past acquisitions and precedent. They asked for a payment plan. They offered a smaller figure accompanied by promises of goodwill and strategic partnership. One of the lawyers tried a classic move, paint the crisis as an event that could be fixed without the money. "We have a migration plan and teams in place," they said. I let them talk because talk reveals need. The more they reassured themselves, the more they exposed the gaps in their timeline. Vendors who would not trust an untested pipeline, an ops team that had fewer hours than months, customers who would notice missing reconciliations and start asking for refunds. I listened to the sound of the logic board clicking in their heads as they ran scenarios. At some point during the bargaining, Richard stopped speaking as CEO and started speaking as a steward of the company's survival. "We could buy the IP," he said quietly. "We could acquire it and avoid a long rebuild, but we'll have to make sure the numbers line up." You rarely hear that phrasing in earnest without a calculation attached to it. Make sure the numbers line up. Everything in the room was in that instant pragmatic. No one wanted spectacle. They wanted the trains to run. There were 2 offers over the next 48 hours, an immediate one-time purchase for the price I named, contingent on standard closing conditions, and an alternative offer that was essentially a staged purchase, milestone payments in exchange for immediate restoration of service under escrow. The second option was tempting for them. It de-risked the board's immediate cash flow anxiety. It was tempting for me because it preserved negotiating postures while getting paid. I had to decide if I wanted a clean break or to keep a foot in the door as a paid consultant. I took the middle road. I asked for a lump sum payment that covered the protectable revenue plus an upfront escrow for transition work, with the caveat that the company would sign a simple non-derivative clause, preventing them from distributing or reselling the IP in parallel ventures for a short window. Nothing dramatic, no lifetime royalties, no absurd restrictions, just a way to ensure that my work wasn't turned into a cheap knockoff without compensation. It was business, it was proportional, it was boringly enforceable. They countered with lawyers, spreadsheets, and a timeline that included a board vote. I demanded a timeline that matched the math of customer expectations. They looped in their outside counsel. Heavy Metal Dave and I sipped Old Crow like an offering and watched the dance we had choreographed months earlier play out in slow motion. Negotiations, even when they're strictly transactional, feel personal. You can sense the embarrassment when a CEO realizes they outsourced a core competency and didn't secure the terms. You can see it in the way their voice drops when they realize they are asking not for ingenuity, but for the right to keep what they never actually owned.
For a man like Richard, it was a problem of stewardship. For Jared, it was an ego problem wrapped in a pivot. By the end of the second day, they made an offer within the ballpark. It was efficient, but someone had tried to make it feel like generosity. They wanted access restored immediately if I would accept payments staged across 30 and 60 days. I proposed escrow, money into a neutral account, released once systems confirmed green, with standard warranties and a transfer agreement. They agreed. I don't relish money as weapon narratives, but numbers clear things that words cannot. We signed the transfer documentation because the transfer documentation is the civics of this business. Signatures, representations, indemnities, an inventory of modules labeled in legalese. My lawyer and their lawyers swapped red lines like people trading polite blows. We negotiated language about legacy support and training sessions. I added a single sardonic line in a transitional schedule, data integrity and reconciliation behaviors to be preserved to prevent regression into manual processes. They accepted it. Payment cleared in the way corporate payments do, with a flurry of approvals, a procurement code that required 3 people to sign off, and a final wire that made the manila folder feel less like a symbol and more like an exchange. I watched the confirmation ping on my phone and felt a relief that was almost boring. It was not triumph. It was the relief of a debt paid, the settling of accounts.
Access was restored under the terms we agreed. The red lights receded. The dashboards went green, with the gradual patience of systems that had been badly missed. People exhaled at headquarters, as if they had been holding breath for weeks. Jared's face on video thawed from panic to a version of apology he probably never intended to feel. He thanked me with the clumsy grace of someone who had been taught to lead by slide decks rather than by consequence. Richard offered what board chairs offer in moments like this: a public thanks and private commitments to change governance around vendor relationships. Brenda was quietly relieved because the person who had to shepherd the optics had less to shepherd now. Mike texted a photo of a Slack channel filled with celebratory GIFs. The kid knew how to mark a victory with a dancing potato. There was an odd, quiet exchange in which I made one thing abundantly clear: I would not rejoin as an employee. The last thing I wanted was to be invited back to the table, only to be asked later to accept less credit than the work warranted. The team could hire a new staffer or contract me as a vendor if they wanted continuity. They chose to buy. The purchase meant they owned the code and the responsibility that came with it. I had been generous in the negotiation, but clear in the handoff. After the dust settled, the company executed the transfer. The legal paperwork sat in my inbox like a stack of small monuments. I signed the closing docs surrounded by the smell of coffee and a stack of takeout containers that had been my substitute for community for the last few weeks. I wired a portion into accounts I used to pay my taxes, to finance a small trip I had been promising myself since the pandemic, and to Mike's surprise bonus for the part he had played as a quiet witness who fed me facts without fanfare. That's when the calls came from the people I hadn't expected. Stan, a director of engineering over at Apex, one of the companies that watched our revenue numbers with unhealthy admiration, left a voicemail. It was brusque, slightly formal, and then oddly warm about the clarity with which I get acted. "We could use someone who owns their work," he said. "Would you be interested in consulting, or maybe something more permanent?" Apex wasn't some underdog. They were efficient at courting people who had domain knowledge and very good at paying. Stan pitched a role that was exactly the kind of work I liked: to help them build a next-gen system with the explicit caveat that it would be architected to avoid the traps I had seen. He wanted me as a vendor-turned-architect, design, oversight, and not a part of the broken inside. There was a temptation there that had nothing to do with money. There was creativity in the idea of building something new at scale with a team that both understood the value of durability and respected the people who built it.
There was also the thrumming human curiosity of being the person who gets to say no to poor design choices from the start. I took coffee with Stan. He smelled faintly of good cologne and optimism that wasn't theatrical. We talked not in slides, but in specifics: how teams communicate, how contracts are structured, how to avoid letting a CEO's vision become a unilateral order to erase work. He listened when I talked about the ridiculousness of slippery ownership language, and read back what I had said without trying to make it mean something else. That was rare. It felt like being seen without having to stage a performance. 2 weeks later, I signed a consulting contract with Apex. It was a flat fee retainer plus milestones, and included provisions that, importantly, recognized my authorship of past systems and my right to advise without being dragged into internal politics. I would be paid to architect and to teach their new teams how to think in ways that prevent the very brittle decisions Jared had made. It wasn't vengeance, it was choice. There were consequences for the people at the company I left behind. Publicly, there was an unfavorable press release that traded volatility for venture drama, and the stock took a modest dip the day after the outage. Investors enjoy a good volatility narrative when they can trade it, and this was, for them, a little story about governance and risk. Internally, there were whispered reassignments. Jared's title lost some of its shine when a committee was assembled to review strategic technical leadership. He moved to a role that had fewer public-facing responsibilities and more meetings with compliance. The company spoke about learning and humility in the way companies do, with pithy memos and mandatory training. I felt a measured satisfaction at the unfolding. Vindication, when it's allowed to be quiet and proportional, is not a fireworks show. It's a ledger entry that balances. I thought about the sweetheart line Jared had used, casual weaponization of familiarity that sits in the same toxic category as, "You're so emotional." Those little slaps stay with people. They condense into exhausted exhalations and the decision to do something that has teeth. Mike reached out often after the deal closed. He wanted to know about architecture and careers. He wanted to know how to read a contract like a person who had his future to shepherd. We had coffee in a small pub one rainy afternoon. He ate nachos like they were research, and asked questions with the hunger of someone who wanted to be better than the managers he had been given. I told him about reading clauses and about how to make your work visible. I told him at the end that the thing that changes power dynamics is not anger necessarily, but literacy. Legal literacy, financial literacy, the small skill of keeping records. "Are you going to gloat to LinkedIn?" he asked, half teasing and half earnest. "No," I said.
That is a terrible platform for complicated feelings. Maybe a blog post someday about professional friction. Nothing that broadcasts people's failures. I meant it. Part of dignity is not dragging other people across every soapbox. A month after the transfer, Apex invited me to a small offsite to begin design work. I found myself in a rented house with whiteboards, coffee that didn't taste like corporate survival, and a team whose default orientation was to ask questions before making unilateral edicts. It felt like the right kind of work, restorative, constructive, and underpinned by contracts that recognized boundaries. I didn't return to the company that bought the IP. Their purchase had been a pragmatic move. My presence would have complicated things. There are places you are better off being a vendor to. Meanwhile, life stayed small in good ways. My cat demanded her breakfast at exact times, the manila folder acquired a place on a shelf as a reminder, and Danny DeVito videos remained a guilty, perfect distraction when negotiations felt too much like theater. People asked me, privately, if I regretted the way I had forced consequences. I have tried to refuse the neat binary of remorse or triumph. There was no joy in the red lights. There was only a recognition that arrangements have consequences, and that people in positions of power discover inconvenient legal realities when they forget to read their contracts. I felt neither gleeful cruelty nor moral superiority, just the peculiar satisfaction that comes when order is restored through the means that were agreed upon from the start. I learned, too, about the costs of being the kind of person who insists on their rights. There were nights I replayed the what-ifs. What if the board had called my bluff? What if litigation had dragged on a year and eaten the premium with fees? What if a different set of people had been hurt in the outage? Those thoughts kept me cautious. Winning a negotiation is not an immunity from doubt. It is a decision with reverberations. In the months that followed, Jared's career trajectory drifted in a way that is familiar to anyone who's watched corporate theater. People lose titles quietly, committees form to reassess hiring decisions. The market is unsentimental. He stayed in the industry, though his speeches grew less flamboyant and his metaphors less grand. He watched his watch less to check its style and more to count the hours he had to spend fixing the gap between vision and reality. Richard reached out occasionally to check on transition work and to ask for recommendations on governance. He was at heart a pragmatic man who had perhaps finally learned that if you are stewarding other people's livelihoods, you should not let your managers play fast and loose with contractual obligations. He sent one small, sincere email that said simply, "We could have done better. Thank you."
I accepted the thanks with an acknowledgement of the complexity that had produced it. The company stabilized,
rebuilt parts of their pipeline over the course of a year, and implemented vendor oversight that, if not perfect, was better than what they'd had. Apex built a new system that honored the principles I'd insisted on: clear ownership boundaries, meaningful runbooks, and dev processes that elevated the people who did the work. It wasn't a utopia, it was less fragile, and that felt like success enough. There is a small ceremonial thing I did with the manila folder. I didn't laminate it or put it on a mantle. I put it in a frame with the date of the transfer and a small printed note that read, "Read your contracts." It's a private talisman, a reminder of the dull, efficient power of paperwork over performative heroism. It hangs in my apartment over the little desk where I write invoices and where sometimes I watch the city or the rain. People ask me what I would have done differently, and the answer is simple and a little dull. I would have insisted on better conversations earlier. Contracts are not only about how to extract value, they're about setting expectations. If executives had better governance, if people had learned to respect the invisible work of operations, maybe there wouldn't be a narrative about a CTO who thought he could delete a system and a licensor who thought to enforce her rights. But reality is what we have, peopled with errors and occasionally corrected by the tools we've agreed to use. I tell the story now not to celebrate punitive outcomes, but to underline an ugly truth many learned the hard way. Invisible infrastructure is not optional. It has authors, maintainers, defenders. When those human contributions are overlooked, the cost is paid in real time by customers, by payrolls, and sometimes by reputations. And yes, I did not plan to become a cautionary tale or a hero. I wanted to be compensated fairly for the work I did. That is not a luxurious aspiration. It's a basic professional expectation. If you like stories where hubris meets a spreadsheet and learns a lesson, hit subscribe. Helps buy me calming tea and funds more tales about people who keep the lights on. That's my one pitch for the road. Be careful what you clap for when someone is getting taught a lesson. The sale made me independent in the practical sense. The payment bought a breathing space where I could choose the next work I did, rather than accept what was handed to me. It bought me time to write, consult, and build again with people who respected the craft. It also bought me a moral complication. I had enforced a consequence that harmed a lot of people who were not Jared, not Richard, not the board, just employees trying to keep their lives intact. That sits with me. The ledger isn't only financial, it is also human. In quiet moments now, I think about the night 3 years earlier, when Quantum Ops had been stitched together in crisis.
The code was ugly, but it saved lives then, in the sense that it kept supply chains moving and families fed. I think about the small satisfactions of debugging at 3 a.m., about the thrill of seeing a pipeline hold under load, about the loneliness of being the person who knows the ropes. Those memories keep me humble. They also remind me that dignity is often won in small, quiet acts: documenting, invoicing, insisting on proper terms. Legal literacy doesn't feel glamorous. It feels like doing your homework and then sitting at the table when others try to rearrange the meal. People underestimate the power of being the one person who keeps records and knows how to use them. It is not a violent power. It is a stabilizing, boring one. It is how houses are kept and how companies, ideally, learn to respect the people who built their foundations. A year after the deal closed, I took a small trip to a coastal town I had been promising myself. I walked on a beach with pockets full of pebbles and a head full of plans. I drank coffee that tasted like sunlight and thought about the odd arc of that week that had become a small inflection point in my life. Mike had joined a small team at Apex. He sent a picture of himself with a lanyard that fit and a hoodie that wasn't from a company that bragged more than it delivered. He was better positioned because he had been willing to learn and to keep receipts. Jared published an article about moving fast responsibly and was later quoted in panels as someone who had learned the governance lesson. He did not call me to apologize. I did not call him to gloat. People change in the way people do, slowly and often in the margins. The important thing was that the company learned to value what it used. If you ever find yourself in a room where someone tells you to delete the work of another person and calls it progress, pause. Read the contract. Ask what will be lost. Think about customers who will see the difference. And if you are the person who built something, keep your records, invoice like a professional, and do not let theater substitute for governance. There is one last small image that keeps me steady: the manila folder in its frame, the small sticky note that says payable 30 days, and a mug that reads "Hold the Fort" on my desk. It's not a trophy. It's a reminder. Ownership isn't a headline. It's a clause. Control isn't just a swagger. It's paperwork and patience and the willingness to enforce terms when they are violated. So yes, the CTO fired me over my code. Then he discovered I controlled everything. It was not a melodramatic reveal. It was a business lesson delivered in invoices and signatures. I walked away. If you want more of this, people who built in chaos, who were underappreciated, who used the small tools of contracts and records to set things straight, let me know.
Vote in the comments if you prefer a deeper dive into negotiating IP deals or a behind-the-scenes look at rebuilding resilient logistics platforms. I'll tell you what I can without turning this into a technical manual. There are still boundaries to respect in how systems are handled. But above all, own the keys you can own. Read your agreements. Keep your receipts. Be the person who can make a calm, contractual choice when the room fills with panic. It's not about being cruel. It's about being professional. I poured a measure of Old Crow that night in celebration and reflection, then put the bottle back in the cupboard. Small rituals help. They don't fix everything, but they remind you who you are when the spreadsheets are cleared and the lights go back on.